Good afternoon and welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series. My name is Stefan Freeland and I'm the host of the series. We've got two more talks this year before we're going to call it a quarter. As usual, we'll have time for questions at the end, and you can post those into the Q&A at any time and we'll get to as many as we can. Our guest today is Tom Mumford. Tom has a PhD in botany from UW a few years back. Went on to work with the Washington Department of Natural Resources and a bunch of other good folks. He's worked with kelp in a bunch of interesting ways, including the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation and Recovery Plan. Sits in an advisory role in the Puget Sound Restoration Fund Kelp Project. Alternate on the Strategic Advisory Council for OCNMS, and is on the Science Advisory Committee for the Northwest Straits Initiative. So doing a bunch of good work. He's currently situated out at the Friday Harbor Labs out at the UW Labs out at Friday Harbor, which he tells me he's actually been teaching live classes with real students. What a great, how lucky you are. So we're going to learn about kelp. I was thrilled. I loved that Tom brings to the class the presentation here today. The passion of, we need to know about kelp, and so Tom is going to tell us about kelp with passion. Tom, are you with us? Welcome. And I think you're still muted.
Right.
There you go.
I almost clicked it right. There we go.
Welcome.
All right. Thank you. All
yeah.
right. So anyway, thank you, Stefan, for getting me on here. And this is a treat. I was looking at all the other speakers that are on here. I'm pretty honored, let's put it that way, to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and do the PowerPoint sharing business. And let's make sure this is going to work for everybody here. Are we good?
Looks good.
All right. Fair enough. So again, I'm out here at the labs right now teaching, and I'm retired. I worked for the state of Washington for years, and quote, retired. And that's an interesting story in its own right. So I'm out here having a great time teaching future phycologists about kelp. And I wanted to share some of this stuff with you today. What I really want to say is that kelp has, first of all, been a traditional food and a source of materials since time immemorial for all these Pacific Northwest First Nations and tribes. And I acknowledge and I give thanks to those who have cared for and managed and been sustained not only by the kelp, but by all these rich gifts of the Salish Sea. And they've been guided by the generations of traditional ecological knowledge keepers. We now have a lot to correct, not only the ecological and the social mess that we've made, but we need to rethink our approach. And I want to emphasize that, rethinking our approach. And to get there, we newcomers, me, must respect and acknowledge the injustices of the past and the present, while learning and practicing a demonstrated, sustainable way to the future. So I want to give this talk today in the spirit of all of us, being in the same canoe. And I want to let us all paddle forward together. So I want to tell their story. I want to tell the story about kelp today. And this is a different way of doing it as opposed to lecture in the sense that it is a lecture on one hand, but I want to tell their story. Robin Kimmer, who many of you heard last week, spoke. And she, in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, had this little quote that I immediately grabbed on, having spent a lot of my career putting names on things. Yes, I have learned the names of all the bushes, but I have yet to learn their songs. And I am in the business of listening and then learning their songs, and then to tell that story. Thoreau put it a little differently. He said, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. And I tell my students this again and again, it's what you see that really counts. So let's kind of keep that in the back of your heads as we proceed today. It's a kind of a mindset that I'm trying to foster here, that we're learning about stories, we're telling those stories, and how we tell those stories is really important. Let me just do a little background here. I don't have any idea what people know or don't know about kelp, so I'm going to do a little Kelp 101 primer here, but I'm going to cut to the chase right now. Um, basis. And I also want you to think about caring for the inherent beauty of these things, these plants, as well as reciprocate for all the gifts that they provide. So it's this Kimmerer idea that we're reciprocating here. And these are gifts that are given to us. It's not transactional, it's relational. So here's a bunch of different kinds of kelp here. But what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the kelp and who lives there, who lives where in the kelp, who lives in a kelp forest. Then I also want to talk a little bit about who eats what. And then after that, we can kind of get into, so what does that mean to this whole ecosystem that we live in, and all the different avenues that kelp travels through this ecosystem. And then ultimately us, and how do we fit into this ecosystem? We are part of the ecosystem, and how do we work within all that? So kelp is a really diverse group here in the state of Washington. We have more species of kelp here than almost anywhere else in the world except Hokkaido, I think. Here's just some pictures of these things. Some of them float, some of them are down on the bottom, some of them get really large, 150, 200 feet long in California, maybe not so many here. Some of them are maybe only a few feet long. Lots of different ones and lots of different ways that they interact in the environment. Just for the fun of it, I helped the Puget Sound Partnership make this poster, and it has all the different kelps in Puget Sound on it. And so, and you can, here's where you can get it if you want it. But it's kind of fun because I helped her say, oh, this isn't right, holdfast not quite right, or the blade doesn't look quite like that. It was with an artist who had never seen kelp really before. So we had a great time together. But this is the array of what we're dealing with here in the state of Washington. This is a little geeky, but it's kind of fun to think about. There are three different kinds of seaweed. We've got reds, browns, and greens. And anybody that's been on the beach probably can pretty quickly pick those out. The brown seaweeds are really this is the tree of life. And over here, you've got humans down here in the bottom, and you've got green seaweeds and red seaweeds, which are the archaeoplastics. These are called plants per se. And then the brown seaweeds up here in the corner where the kelp are called protists. And I just want you to appreciate that they're in a whole different part of the tree of life. They're not related very much at all to reds or greens or land plants, but how they fit into the bigger scheme of things here. Kelp in the state of Washington are in a lot of different places. These were maps we made back around 2000, and we kind of split the shoreline up into what we call floating kelp. There are a couple of species here that float, that make a canopy. Bull kelp is the one that we think about most. And then there's other kelps, other 20 some odd species that don't float, that are on the bottom. And these red lines show here the extent of those areas in about 2000 of that. Remember, if you start walking down on the Oregon border and you walk to the Canadian border and you hit every mile of shoreline and every island, you've gone 2,500 miles. You've walked to Boston. And this is how much kelp there is. There's a lot of 31% of that mileage is floating kelp. I mean, some submerged kelp, and 11% is floating kelp. There's a lot of kelp in this state. And I look out the window here at Friday Harbor, and I tell the people here, folks, if you look at this map in here, we are surrounded by kelp. You don't go anywhere without going over, through, around kelp in this situation. So it's a lot of different species in a lot of different places, mostly attached to rocky substrate. It doesn't like soft bottoms particularly. It attaches to cobble, attaches to bedrock, worm tubes once in a while. So it's in a lot of different places like this. Just a quick reminder, kelp is a plant and it photosynthesizes. So like all plants, it takes light takes carbon dioxide out of the water, takes water itself, takes nutrients, things like nitrogen, phosphorus. So it's really no different in that respect. It has a photosynthetic pathway, chlorophyll and so forth in it. So it's not that exotic. Photosynthesizes. The thing we'll talk about here in a minute is that it really photosynthesizes. This stuff cranks. It really makes a lot of kelp very quickly. Just keep in mind, these plants here, the bull kelp plants, start from the bottom. They have a hollow bulb up here, come to the surface. Those plants can elongate a foot a day this time of year. A foot a day. They grow a foot a day. There's that much photosynthesis going on. So a kelp plant, probably if you've been on the beach very much, you've seen these things. This is a sugar kelp, it's called. These can get to be 3 or 4 feet long. They start off as microscopic stages. We'll see in a minute. They got a holdfast, little things that stick on the bottom. They don't really go into the bottom. They just stick to the bottom, rocks, a little stipe, and a blade like this. How do they grow? Well, it's really interesting. We have the students who do this. You can take and punch holes in this blade, and you plunge them at regular intervals, about 5 centimeter intervals. And you put them out in the water. You come back a week later, and you say, well, what's going on here? The plant normally doesn't get much bigger, but these bottom holes down here start to spread out. This is where the growth is taking place. The top holes don't really spread out. So it's like a conveyor belt being pushed up from the bottom. You come back and that hole's gone further and further. And by the end of this whole thing, this bottom hole basically just tatters off the end. So this dotted line up here is parts of the plant that have just, like the end of a flag, have just fallen off and releases what we call particulate matter. They're slimy, so there's this dissolved organic material coming off these things. And then you figure that what the biomass that you get, actually there's 4 or 5 times that amount of biomass that's been produced in a year that has disappeared into the food web. People don't think about this. They might look at a piece of kelp. They don't know that this growth is taking place and happening so rapidly. So this is one of the secrets of kelp, like this. One of the other things that most of you have been around here very long, particularly with bull kelp, this is a bull kelp bed off of the labs here. If you look very carefully right behind this, this is Turn Island. Right back here in the corner is where I am, right there. That's the Party Harbor Labs are situated back there. But what I want you to pay attention to is this bull kelp bed. These float, they're at the surface. They disappear in the fall. They're annuals. There's maybe a few plants left over like leaves on an oak tree, but by and large, most of these plants disappear. So where do they go in the wintertime? Some kelp perennials, but there's a lot of annuals that come up, do their thing in the summertime, and they disappear. So what happens? So here's a diagram of one of these big kelp plants. They got the holdfast, they got a big long stipe, the bulb is hollow up here at the top, floats. So these blades are up at the surface where they get lots of light. Good strategy. Why be at the bottom where there's no lights? They'll be in 100 feet of water sometimes, 30 feet of water. So there's not so much light at the bottom. And if you look very carefully at these plants, out here at the tips of the blades, you're going to find these dark patches. And these dark patches have a white line around them. And in these is where they produce millions and millions of little tiny spores. And these spores then swim in the water. They have little flagella on them. They swim around in the water and they settle down in the bottom in the fall and make these little tiny microscopic plants. This is just to give you an idea. This is inside the circle is to scale. These little plants here, 15 of those to make a human hair. They're tiny. These things are absolutely tiny. Males, females, the female egg is fertilized with motile sperm. And then in the springtime, you get a little tiny juvenile, tiny, you can't even see with just with a microscope. So these things, some microscopes, pictures of these things, they're the males, are the skinny ones, the females, the big ones. Here's the eggs out here. And they'll make a little tiny plant that are just the size of a period on the end of the sentence. And within a month or 2 months, they'll be 100 feet long. That's the secret. And we don't know anything or very little about these. They are out there, they grow, put them in a lab and grow them, but where are they in the field? Not much known about these things. So there's a really interesting mystery part of the story that we've still got. So that's a little primer. We've got lots of different kinds. They grow on rocky habitats. They're all over everywhere in the state of Washington. It's a big deal. There's a lot of them. And they go through this life history. They grow really fast. They can produce an enormous amount of material in a relatively short period of time. And there's clever ways of looking at that. So I talk about seaweed uses. So what are these uses? And I'm going to equate those to what I'm going to call ecosystem functions. So what can they do? Two main things, and these are the take-homes today, if you will. One of these is what we call a structuring element. They're biogenic habitats. They're foundation species. They make a structure that things live in. I'll show some pictures here in a minute, but they're actually a place, okay? And as I've mentioned here before, they are primary producers. That means they're fixing carbon, they're making kelp plants, and then we'll track where those kelp plants end up. They also have a lot of biodiversity functions. So there's in the holdfast, in kelp beds, the biodiversity is much higher than it is outside of a kelp bed for a lot of different reasons. Places to live, things to eat, places to hide, so forth. So you got a place to live, you got food, you got lots of neighbors. This is what kelp forests are really all about. So these foundation species, this is a diagram from California. Some of these critters we don't have here, but the idea is basically there are a whole lot of things that live in these kelp beds. As I said, it's a place to hide. It's a place to get away from predation. It's a place to eat things that are on the surface of kelp. You can eat the kelp itself. You can use them to guide your migration. So there's a lot of reasons to be in these foundation species kind of place. It's a physical kind of a thing, okay? And if you start talking to people who fish, who are fishers, that you will find out that a whole bunch of them will say, you betcha, and TEK will say, this is where we go fish. And so we have direct associations in habitat or behavioral modifications for anybody who fishes for rockfish, fishes for salmon, these kind of things. Kelp beds are the place to be. Eelgrass beds are fine and dandy, and they are too, but kelp beds are right up there in the same way. And then there's all these what I call indirect associations. So the basic food web, which we'll talk about here in a second. Herring substrate, usually on kelp, refuge from predation, migratory pathways. And it turns out that a lot of these kelp beds are critical habitat for juvenile rockfish. The rockfish spawn and the little babies have to live in kelp beds. So we've got these ESA listings of rockfish totally dependent upon kelp. So all of a sudden the ESA people are starting to pay more attention, not to the rockfish, but how do you make rockfish? And kelp beds are right at the top of that list. This is a paper that just came out the other day, or not the other day, it was, in 2020, last year. And Schaefer did this, but just counting the number of herring, salmon, sand lance, and surf smelt in a kelp bed, which is green, versus outside the kelp bed. And you get the picture here. There's a lot more herring, salmon, sand lance, and surf smelt in a kelp bed than there is not in a kelp bed. So this biogenic habitat thing is really important, particularly around here. So primary productivity, I keep harping about this, but let's talk about it for just a second here. The primary productivity, again, the ability to fix carbon. This is a graph that shows you how many kilograms of carbon are fixed per meter square, so about a yard square, over a year. So it's a measure of how much carbon is brought into and turned into plant material. Macrocystis is up in about 4. This is down in California. Tatoosh is 2.5, let's call it that. You get into coral reefs, they're kind of in the same ballpark. Rainforest, 1.5. Tropical seagrasses, 1, blah, blah, blah. I get down here, open ocean, so forth. There's a lot more open ocean, but it doesn't mean it's productive. Alfalfa fields are in the rainforest category. But the bottom line is there's an enormous very large amount of carbon being fixed in these systems in comparison to almost any other system going. So that's just something to keep in the back of your head. Four up to 4, okay? So this is one of my old diagrams that's been around, what, 1988? Somebody made this. It's an old diagram, but it shows very nicely graphically. So what? So here's the deal. You got the sun up here. There's sun energy coming into, and this whole thing was done down in the Namibia. This is off South Africa. So that kelp plant that you see here, which is this black thing, is a kelp plant that occurs down there. But the story has been repeated here, and the numbers are very similar. These are good numbers. So the production here, in this particular case, they came out of grand carbons, which is about 1 kilogram. So not 4, but 1. But it's a nice number because we can do our mental math a little bit better here. So let's say about 1 kilogram of carbon is fixed in this plant per year. So what happens to it? What happens to it? So you think about what everybody eats kelp. It's just the thing to eat. And it turns out in those systems, and most of the systems, only maybe 1% is actually eaten by things like abalone, which actually crawl up and eat the plant itself. Not much gets actually deliberately, physically consumed in place, okay? On the other hand, about 10% of the plant gets broken off, big chunks, and comes loose and goes into debris feeders and goes into beach stranding, which we're talking about there. So 10% of the plant is broken off, goes into debris feeders. Any of you been to the outer coast, you see these purple urchins. They're hunkered down in these little crevices and little cups that they make. And they're sitting there waiting for this debris to get caught on their spawns. That's the whole game that they play. So they're a debris feeder, okay? But the real action is, turns out, it's in what we call particulate matter. This is the carbon debris. This is the stuff. Remember the diagram about how the kelp fratters off the end? 75% of the kelp plant gets made into little teeny weeny particles that float away. Particles, but they float away. And then about 1/3 gets made into this dissolved organic material. If any of you been on the beach, you picked a piece of kelp up, it's slimy. You go, oh my God, sticky kind of slimy stuff. That's the dissolved organic material that comes off of that. And it just gets exuded, just thrown out into and washed away into the bacteria are the primary consumers for that. Particulate matter is really interesting because it goes into things that people normally don't think about eating kelp. These are the filter feeders. These are the mussels. These are the oysters. These are the things, the barnacles. It turns out they love plankton naturally, but what often they have most access to are these little particles, which they eat up, and they love it dearly. And so there's all this thing where the debris feeders, beach stranding, get the feces, go into the bacteria, the protozoan, and so forth. So a lot of this kelp ends up in these filter feeders. And a lot ends up on the beach, debris feeders, and so forth. Well, good. So you got these things eating kelp. But let's keep going. And this is a fun story. This is one that people are now just really beginning to get a handle on. And that is the fact that kelp makes all this, fixes all this carbon. People believe it. That's nice. What you can do is you can track these carbon, the carbon itself, through what they call stable isotopes. Carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14 is radioactivity. You do the same thing with nitrogen and sulfur. You can track the carbon as it goes through the food web. You can actually say that a plant or an animal has eaten so much of a particular thing, depending upon the ratio of these carbon isotopes. And kelp has a particular, not peculiar, but a particular set of ratios that you can then track. So here's the percent contribution of these animals of kelp. So you can say that this middleus edulis, which is the mussel, which is normally considered to be a filter feeder, is about 25% kelp. 25% of its food came from kelp. Okay? You get down here and you get to these little amphipods. This amphipod is 95% kelp. Think about that. Then you start going up the food web, you get into things like sea stars. So a sea star here is in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% kelp. You get into things like a diving bird, which you would never think of eating. They don't eat kelp. They eat things that eat kelp, that eat kelp, that eat kelp. And here you go, like 45% of that cormorant is kelp. There's been some studies done on rockfish. Rockfish on the open coast are about half kelp. A guy named Paul Chitaro working on this. I stole this slide from him with his permission, but he's been looking at the dietary connections of marine invertebrates and fishes. So he's been looking at rockfish, perch, guillemots, crabs, and so forth. And here's the percent kelp carbon that come from eelgrass, come from epiphytes growing on the eelgrass, kelp itself, and this particulate matter. And he can't tell a particulate matter from the kelp particularly, but he can track, and he can say that a rockfish, quillback, is 30% kelp. Rockfish, shiner perch, pigeon guillemot, this is 17% of that guillemot is kelp carbon. Crabs, 25%. He's working on salmon, and I really want him to work on orcas. How much of an orca comes from kelp at the bottom of that food web? Think about that. This is where I really want you to get your head around the fact that kelp not only is a good habitat, but it drives so much of these food webs, particularly in a place like the Salish Sea. It's incredibly important in these food webs. Another part of this food web story is really interesting and people are beginning to look at now is you think about that going off and it goes into deep water, it goes into feeding nearshore critters and so forth. You've all been on the beach. This is what happens in the fall in particular, right? You get a lot of stuff washing up on the beach. So what happens to that? It gets consumed by isopods and other different kinds of critters. It provides nutrients, but a whole bunch of these invertebrates, it turns out, get eaten by things like shorebirds, seabirds, marine mammals, and fishes. So all this stuff gets turned into different parts of the rack cycle, either back in the marine system. What they're finding now is they've done some work up on the islands in British Columbia. There's all kinds of lizards, rodents, birds, deer, all these things that come down and forage on the beach, eating things that are eating the kelp. So a lot of this kelp and the nutrients in the kelp are going up. It's kind of like the salmon going up the streams. So the kelp is going up in the terrestrial systems as well. So that's just kind of an idea of where the kelp is going. And it turns out that that is the big sort of evolving story now that everybody's getting really excited about, that people haven't realized before. It's really, really been fun to watch the ahas. Oh my God, it's all turned into who's eating who. So let's talk about this who eating who thing for just a minute. And there's a wonderful term we call a trophic cascade. It's not a train, it's not some mountains, but it's an ecological concept of a series of who eats who. And I say a series of who eats who, which are much related to what we just got through talking about. So the classic one that people have looked at for a very long time, looking at the time here, we got a little more time, kelp and urchins. So urchins eat kelp. So if you have a lot of urchins, you don't get much kelp. They do in fact chomp on it, particularly when the kelp are little tiny guys. And you end up, if you get too many, you end up with an urchin bear. Nothing but urchins and not much kelp. On the other hand, if you have a sea otter in this situation, which they found up in the Aleutians, they love to eat urchins. And if you don't have any urchins, then you get a lot of kelp. So it's this flip that you get, and you get a nice big kelp bed. You can also do the same thing by harvesting urchins, okay? And the urchins go down, kelp goes up. So there's this what we call a trophic cascade. So there's sort of this thing where something happens in one part of the food web and it has this ripple effect all the way down to what happens to the kelp. And then the kelp, as we'll see in a minute, then feeds back into the system. So this is a history, but there's a lot more of these examples popping up more and more. In the last couple of years, we've had an absolutely stunning occurrence in Northern California. Northern California has lost its almost entire not macro, this is bull kelp beds. And the bull kelp is here in the middle of these things. And it turns out that's a really interesting story. The kelp is gone. And what happened here was we've got a $44 million a year abalone fishery. We've got a huge urchin roe fishery down here. And so normally the sea stars, the Pycnopodia, will eat the urchins, and the urchins kind of this happy balance with the kelp. So this is a trophic cascade. Instead of talking about otters, we're going to be talking about sea stars eating urchins, which eat kelp. And the abalone also does the same thing. And then that kelp food, then it goes into the crabs, goes into the guillemots, goes into the rockfish and so forth, right? 2013, fall of 2013, they had something happen. And star, the got rid of, and basically these are gone. So what happens? You got a trophic cascade, right? All of a sudden, whoa, nobody's eating me anymore. How many more urchins? They're all over everywhere. And that results in the loss of the kelp beds. So this is what people are seeing. But the consequences of this are interesting in that all of a sudden that the abalone starved to death. There's nothing for them to eat. So there goes a $44 million a year fishery. Boom. Then, we don't know this yet, but I'm waiting for what happens to the birds, what happens to the rockfish, what happens to the crabs. They don't have that percentage of kelp carbon to eat. And the other thing that's going on, urchins can hang out, it turns out, for years. They just sit there. They're called zombie urchins. There's no rowing. They're just waiting. They just sit and wait just for years and years and years. And so right now in California, there's urchins everywhere. There's no abalone. There's no kelp. So this is the ramifications of these trophic cascades, and then how this all filters down through these ecosystems, and the ramifications it has for not only all the critters that live there, but some of the people that depend upon the fisheries as well. So let's talk a little bit about people directly with kelp for just a minute here. Traditionally, there were, and I'm not an expert on this, but there were these, the ability, for instance, in a kelp bed where Native Americans would chop a hole in the kelp bed and the salmon would migrate in along the kelp bed. This is what they do, and they still do it. If you're a salmon fisherman, that's where you fish, right along the outside of the kelp bed. When they're migrating in, they would cut a hole. Salmon would migrate into the hole in the kelp bed and you get harvested. So it was a fishing technique, utilizing not kelp itself, but the behavior around kelp of these fish. Then there's all these other kinds of things, lots of different bottles and different kinds of ways that you can use kelp. One of the more interesting ones that I'm aware of, and it's really fascinating, is you can take the bull kelp stipe, the long stipe of the bull kelp. There was a very elaborate way that you could treat this. You would soak it, you would oil it, you would smoke it, you would smoke it again, and so forth, and make fishing lines for halibut, for whaling, and so forth. All the lines that were used for fishing are used for fishing. They're still doing this. Are these basically kelp, treated kelp that can be knotted. And I've been told that people still love these things because when they're wet, they're soft, they're really easy on your hands if you're halibut fishing, for instance. It's still a nice way to fish for halibut. The food aspect of kelp has been interesting. That the, and you probably all know this, the kelp, use of kelp in the Asian countries has been widespread for a very long time. You think about kombu, you think about wakame, you think about seaweed crunches, wakame soup, you think about miso soup with little pieces of seaweed in it and so forth. It turns out that a long time ago, people figured out that kelp was a great flavoring agent. Umami is, I think, the term for the flavoring that people use. Kelp is full of it, and it's a great flavoring agent. So this has been widespread for centuries in Asia as a foodstuff, but not so much in European and for American because of European, largely European food habits, if you will. This is kind of a joke. I mean, it was like, this is 1976, haha, let's eat kelp, but if anybody's been noticing, in the last couple of years, kelp is having its moment. I mean, it is having its moment. All of a sudden, people have discovered that the Asian cuisine and the way kelp cooks and how it tastes and so forth is good. And we're coming up with all these just amazing things, ways, and very elegant ways to eat and use kelp in different kinds of food things now. So it's been really fun to watch the explosion now of kelp as a food in what I want to call Western cuisine, as kind of catching up with Native American and catching up with the Asian approaches to all this. Other uses, it can be used as an animal feed. It's fairly widely known in parts of the world, and it makes it really good. You don't need much, but it adds a lot of micronutrients, it turns out. They're really critical. Uses a fertilizer as a soil conditioner. You go to places like Scotland and all those rocky, barren places, the soil is basically centuries of composted kelp. That's all it consists of. And along with red algae, it's being used for this methane reduction in cows. The other thing that's fun about kelp that people don't know much about, and that is the whole use of what is in that slime. We talked about this slime that comes out of kelp. It's the cell wall material, and it's called algenic acid or algenates. And it's basically a long chain polymer. It's like cellulose in the sense that it's a polymer carbohydrate kind of a thing, but it's slimy. It's got stiff like carbohydrates. And it's used in all these different amazing kind of behind the scenes things that you don't really think about. You don't go out to the store and buy a jug of algenic acid, but you go to any store and it's in all these foods for gel. A lot of things that are gel, instead of having gelatin in it, you can do it organically. You can do it with vegetarian using algenic acid. Textile printing, it's the mordant for all these inks. It turns out that it's used in high-speed printing presses to keep the ink from slinging off the presses. Who would have known? And there's a lot of it that's used for that. Wound dressing, all the modern wound dressing now has a skim of algenic acid on it, dried algenic acid, so it doesn't tear off the scab when you replace the wound, the dressing. Spherification, bioink, they're using this, it makes a gel that you can then do tissue culture on, and then it dissolves, leaving an ear or a nose or whatever you want for organ construction. The other thing that's going on big time right now, this is a hot topic. In fact, there's people at the University of Washington working on this, is algal bioplastics, using algenic acid basically to make biodegradable, non-petroleum based types of plastics. And they're really beginning to get it wired. One of the other fun things that's come along is that they have these, let's say the marathons, and they're plastic water bottles, apparently a huge problem. And so now what they're starting to do is they take algenic acid and you can make a sphere with water in it. You hand them the sphere, you can eat the whole thing, or you can throw it away, it biodegrades. Spherification. The other thing is that, I'm not going to get into much here, but kelp can help you with ocean acidification. It sucks up all that carbon dioxide out of the water and turns it into kelp. So it changes the pH. And there's a bunch of people here locally and elsewhere that are working on how do you mitigate ocean acidification, at least on a local scale, using kelp as the way to do that. Very controversial still, but there's a lot of people very interested in how you can sequester carbon using kelp. How can you take that carbon kelp and put it in a place where it's basically sequestered? Most of it gets turned over pretty quick, but they're thinking about ways to put it in deep ocean, get it out of the system, basically. And given that rate at which you can fix carbon, this becomes a very attractive way to think about it. The other thing is that it takes up a lot of nutrients. And so there's a number of people now growing kelp around like fish farms and oyster farms where there's excess nutrients, and you can suck up those nutrients and make kelp. The other thing that I always laugh about, there's lots of other fun things to do with kelp, and there's sort of what I'm going to call the aesthetic part of this. Kelp baskets are wonderful things. My wife makes kelp baskets, and this fancy one coil in here is what I saw in the store. People make shower curtains and graphic arts kind of stuff. This is the 4th of July parade at Friday Harbor a couple of years ago, and you make kelp horns. If you want to have some fun sometime, walk down the street with a kelp horn and watch people's reactions. It is absolutely hysterical. So there's all these sort of other fun things you have to do. Very quickly, you can think about the cultivation of kelp and how it, and there's a lot of it being cultivated, particularly in Asia. I mean, looky here, you can see the laminaria in China, 100,000 dry metric tons a year. It's used for goiter prevention and a bunch of different things. This is a Alaria cultivation. This is some friends of mine up in Craig, Alaska, growing kelp. Wakame cultivation in Japan. So there's a lot of interest in that. And we're also working on biomass production for biofuels. Can you make enough kelp to actually replace biofuels or fuels using a bio-based, kelp-based operation? And there's work being done at Squim on this as we speak. So those are some of the human interactions, direct, kind of things you can think about. Eating it, you can make product, you can make chemicals from it, these sorts of things. You can grow it. It's a big deal. So, but let's just step back for just a second here. I don't like to do this, but people are doing it, and they're putting numbers on some of these values of these services. Blue carbon, sequestration, nutrient cycle. In other words, all these things about what we're talking about with the fisheries bill and all the birds, commercial fisheries values, alginate industry, we're talking about all the different things you do with alginate. This is the spatial value in the Falkland Islands, came out just last week. Dollars per kilometer of kelp bed per year. $4.5 million per kilometer. Now I want you just to go back and think for a minute about that graph. I don't like to put, we haven't done the numbers for sure, but just in the back of your head, we're talking probably some very, very large numbers when we actually sit down and do this. This is one of the things that needs to be done. But if you want to quantify this kind of stuff, if you don't like it just on aesthetic or ecological basis, if you want to put dollars on it, it can get pretty big pretty fast. Just to say at the end here, all is not going well. This is a grave concern to a whole bunch of us here. Bull kelp in particular, we're losing it, or we have lost it. I've been working with people. I started this back a long time ago. Helen Berry and I started looking at this. I just got this from her the other day. The blue area plus the pink is where bull kelp has been found back in the 1870s. So all over South Puget Sound, there's a lot of bull kelp. The pink is where it is now. That's really scary. Look at Bainbridge Island. There's no kelp left on Bainbridge Island. There's only a smidge left down here in South Sound, 80% over the cumulative total, 68% less. And the only stuff that's left really is here, pretty much in the Narrows, where there's a lot of water motion. So we're really concerned about what are the stressors, what's going on, why is this? We're thinking about temperature, we're thinking about nutrient regimes, we're thinking about waves and currents, we're thinking about different trophic cascade, herbivore kinds of effects, but we don't really know the answer yet. And this is an area where we have to take a lot of time and effort. What about those gametophytes? We don't know anything about this. We're all talking about the big stuff, the sporophyte, the big kelp. We don't know anything about the gametophytes. And we don't know much about the subtidal kelp. This is all floating kelp. We don't even know about the other 27 species about it. Is it coming or is it going? So there's a lot of work to be done. So 2 points. There's a lot of basis for, this is a bigger basis for the ecosystem than I think people have realized, and I want you to walk out here today with that in the back of your head. It's important. It's really important. And that we need to do something about it. So what can we do? And as mentioned before, we just got through writing this conservation plan. And in it, it goes through all these problems, and it goes through, and it kind of prioritizes and thinks about what we can be doing. And I want to say we in a very broad sense. We individuals, we organizations, we as a society, all this is we, okay? All of us need to work on reducing stressors, okay? We need to understand different things going on with the values of these kelps and how they integrate and how these kelp work. So there's a lot of research being done right now here with the Friday Harbor Labs. The Pew Trust is working on how do you integrate into management. Very large effort going on kelp distribution and trends. So this is being led by Helen Berry, now Department of Natural Resources. Salish Indian Nation is working on this, along with the Lower Elwha, and then all these marine resource committees. And any of you there at Huxley want to get involved in something out in the kayak, measuring kelp, go talk to Eleanor Hines. She's on this, the Marine Resource Committee business. Marine protected areas. DNR is working on those things. Big effort now with the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. Betsy Peabody and those folks are looking at and how to restore kelp forests. What I'm doing, what we're all doing, is promoting awareness, engagement. How do we get people into action? How do we get people actually doing things? We got a really amazing thing happen in this last legislative session. We got $1.5 million, which are going to some of these efforts here from the state legislature to work on these problems to implement the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation Recovery Plan. Not too shabby. I mean, Senator Rolfes can help get this through, and thank you for this. So there's all kinds of research and monitoring working group now going on. Get in contact with Helen Berry if you want to kind of keep up with the latest and greatest. And then Western just got through with the State of the Sea Salish report talking about this as well. So there's a lot going on right now with kelp. It's a hot topic. And you can do things and help out. So I'm going to end right now and just say, here I am ready for questions. There's a lot of information out there, and I'm more than willing to answer questions now or get in touch with me, because there's a lot of tendrils in this all over the world. It's not just the state of Washington. There's kelp things going on worldwide. There's a huge amount of effort and thought given to this. We are just a tiny piece of worldwide effort in this whole thing. So with that, I'll stop. Stefan,
Great.
How do you want to do this? We've got a few minutes left here.
Got a bunch of questions. We'll get to as
okay.
At least.
Shall I stop sharing here?
Why don't you leave that up just for a minute or two in case anyone wants to get that address? And yeah, then we'll come back down. So early on, can you speak to the difference between a foundation species and a keystone species?
Keystone species is usually one that's something that it is more like the otter in these trophic cascades. Okay, it's more of a who eats who kind of a relationship. The foundational species are usually thought more in a structural standpoint. They're the place, not who eats who.
Are there ecological
simplistically?
Yeah. Are there ecological concerns revolving with large-scale cultivation of native kelps? Does that have an impact? With
the cultivation, that's a whole game in itself, and doing aquaculture and what are the impacts of that. And yes, there are relatively few, but again, it's you're doing something out there that you weren't doing before. So what are the trade-offs on this thing? It doesn't involve feeding anything. It doesn't involve chemicals. It doesn't involve pesticides, but you are taking up some space that might be used for something else, for instance. So there's been a huge effort in particular places like Scotland and Norway now looking at those impacts. And there's a whole lot of literature coming out of that part of the world right now about what those impacts are.
Yeah.
And it's a trade-off. It's always a trade-off on these things.
Sure. Although, that map you had of the lost areas of where it would have been 100 years ago. So maybe there's
you can, the restoration business is the one that I think is growing kelp to make, say, algenic acid is one part, but many of the same techniques are used or can be used for doing restoration.
Yeah. There was a question, so you talked about how the kelp where does it go? It disappears and then it comes back. And then we talked about how all those things that are eating kelp or eating things that eat kelp. So
right?
when the kelp is all gone, is what replaces it in the food chain?
So in Washington, it's a fairly temperate climate. So a lot of things here are much like a forest, where you've got leaves and things all going on in the summertime. In the wintertime, things get pretty calmed down. So there's a big seasonal aspect to this. So you get a big pulse of food and so forth. Then in the fall, it's gradually, it's like leaves, it falls into the forest and is eaten. And a lot of these things can just survive. The animals that eat that will make it through until the next spring when it picks up again. So yeah, it's seasonal. Right? I think is the answer.
Yeah, yeah.
Now the little gametophytes all kind of tuck down and get out of harm's way often, we think. And so they're not being eaten, and they can do fine, in really low light levels. So like in the wintertime when it's dark and cloudy, they're just fine. Springtime rolls around, they're not exactly like seeds, but they can overwinter like that. Think about it that way.
There's a couple of questions getting at what the effects of kelp harvesting, and is that a concern? Should people be concerned? I guess there's two concerns. One about the effect on the kelp, and secondarily, are there places where it's safer or less safe to be harvesting kelp?
Sure. Well, I think when you think about this today, first of all, I want you to go read Kimmerer's whole book about, and there's a chapter in it called The Honest Harvest. I really think anybody that wants to do this, go read that first and get your mind around the sort of the gift being given and the reciprocity of that gift. Okay, think about that first. It's not transactional. It's not something I can just take. The second thing after today is I want you to think a little bit about, so if I take it, it isn't going to who in the food web, to the fish, to what, there's no such thing as a free lunch. It's coming out of somebody else's mouth. And so it's really, you need to think about how that works. And then what are the trade-offs? It's always a trade-off on these things.
Yeah.
And so like many of these things, how do you fit into this ecosystem, not just kelp, but fish and birds and orcas and salmon and everything else? So that doesn't answer your question exactly, but I think you need to think in that mindset, and then you might read Kimmerer, and then you might have your own answer. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. We've got way more that people are going to have to take a note of this email address if you have some of these questions. And some of these will be continued. A couple more general. Do you separate kelps from seaweeds? Is there a distinction?
Okay. Seaweeds are big marine plants, and I say plants in a general way, and they're usually reds, browns, and greens. Okay, sea lettuce is a green. Red algae, things like dulse and so forth. Brown algae are this particular group I was talking about, and within that group are kelp, and they're normally, so it's a subset of brown seaweeds. That makes sense? So you have algae, which can include little tiny things, and then seaweeds are big algae, and then you've got red, browns, and greens, you've got browns, and then you've got kelp.
Yeah.
And to be technical, they're in the order Laminariales.
Yeah. We're running out of time. Let me just, one last is, what would be involved with kelp restoration? What, both at a statewide, what can the DNR, et cetera, do, but also what can individuals do to promote more kelp?
I would offer that a really good place, and particularly in places like Western, is to, one, you can get involved in research. You can also go volunteer with the marine resource committees. I'm a big fan, and that is more in monitoring, but you're going to get your feet wet. You're going to look at it. You're going to begin to get some ideas about what needs to be done. You can go down and get on the web with the Puget Sound Restoration Fund and look at what they're trying to do as well. You can also, I think it would be interesting, and I haven't had this discussion yet, but go talk with the Salish Sea Nation. They're very concerned about a lot of kelp being lost in the sandwires. And what are the ramifications of that? And what are they thinking about doing? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the answer is there are lots of different ways to do it. And it depends upon who you are,
Yeah.
what your passion is and what your skill level is. The other thing that you can do is you can get involved politically. Kelp is protected through the Shoreline Management Act, through the hydraulics permit, a whole bunch of different permits for protecting kelp. Are those being enforced? And if they're not, you go to the public hearings, you get involved, go be politically active. You have a whole political aspect of this thing as well. So I'm not much on restoration. I'm into actually conservation. Don't lose it in the first place. It's hard to get something going again. Clean up, work on pushing the city of Bellingham to clean up messes or not make messes in the first place.
Yeah.
That may be your best avenue, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, we need to do all the above.
All the above, yeah.
Tom, that's great. I know so much more about kelp than I did an hour ago.
You never dream. Well, this is the whole idea. I want you to go home and dream about kelp tonight, right?
Okay. Next week, we've got one more talk. Next week, it'll be Dr. Rebecca Bunn from Huxley College, talking about soil and how interactions below ground make the above ground possible. So it's sort of a terrestrial corollary to today's talk of a lot of stuff happening right below the water that we're seeing just a little bit on the surface. So, Tom, thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right. Take care.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.